We're joined today by Veldemir Talley, Chief of Police for Maywood, Illinois, Joseph Sneed, owner of the Illinois Conceal and Carry Training Academy, and Tracy Siska, Executive Director for the Chicago Justice Project. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
So this law is relatively new, Chief. Is there any evidence yet that it's had an impact on crime?
Well, no, I don't think that anything allows us to capture those type of statistics. I know that you have to do more of an empirical study to see what the long-term result will be.
What's your sense, just as a working police officer?
No. I'm coming from where one of my detectives just recently solved a homicide, senseless. It was a senseless robbery, and so what this concealed carry does is actually educate people who want to be legal about carrying firearms, as opposed to people who don't.
Joe, you train people. What's the number one reason people come to you looking for this kind of training and in order to get a permit?
No, personal protection for themselves, their family, their loved ones. That's their primary reason for actually getting concealed carry and basically carrying legally. I mean, there are a lot of people out there. There's a part of our communities that basically have been carrying prior to the concealed carry law.
They were carrying illegally.
They were carrying illegally.
And now they want to get legal.
Exactly.
Tracy, this was supposed to have a deterrent effect. What do we know about that?
For the most part, we know that it really doesn't have that impact. The reality is, even carrying a weapon, there's a whole slew of circumstances have to work out right for you to know that the situation's coming for you to actually use your gun. And you know, if you talk to officers on the job, a lot of times people think they can, if they're gonna have a weapon, they're gonna be able to pull it when someone's already got them under, you know, with their gun out. And you can't do that. And even if you talk to everyday police officers, they know that if someone's got a gun on them, it isn't really gonna work. I think this is really more about the idea of feeling safer than actually being safer.
And I think that's a good point, Chief. Holding a gun legally with a permit, carrying it is one thing, but actually using it is another thing. What's your concern as a police chief?
My concern is that I don't think that we passed this law with enough thought into it. As an example, and I'm sure that Mr. Sneed can attest to this, people qualify with any gun when they're going through their training. So you might have someone's wife or older child go 21 or older, go and qualify with a .22 caliber weapon, and then the parent or they will buy a .44 Magnum. Mm-hmm. And the concealed carry law allows them to carry that higher caliber weapon, which they might get themselves into more trouble than not if they were to just test and qualify on whatever weapon they're going to carry concealed.
And Joseph, aren't there relatively few instances allowed by the law where one can actually use a concealed carry weapon? What are they?
Well, you basically have to feel as though you're in an imminent threat of danger in order to actually use it. There have been some instances after the concealed carry law passed and people received their permits where they've actually pulled their weapon and they were charged. So yeah, definitely, you have to actually be in fear of your life or of an assault, or has to be an armed robbery, rape, things of that nature prior to actually pulling your weapon. And you also have to keep in mind that a weapon has to be used, not in all cases, but in most cases, weapons should be applied by the actual aggressor as well.
What do you mean by that?
Well, essentially, if someone is going to threaten your life, so to speak, typically they're going to have a weapon in order to do so. Of course, it could also be
So you're saying that if you have a concealed carry permit and you pull out a gun, the other person there better have a gun too.
Well, they should have a weapon. They should have a weapon. I mean, I'm sure that Chief Talley will, once they investigate that sort of instance, basically a weapon, 9 times out of 10, a weapon should be in place. Okay. However, in some cases, weapons aren't necessary for you to actually pull a weapon. For instance, I'm a small guy. Okay. 2 larger gentlemen basically approaching me, or 3, or a gang of gentlemen. You know, the law, defense laws.
You can pull your gun in that case.
Well, yeah.
There are a lot of places, Tracy, where it's not allowed. Is that a reasonable list? And we're talking about schools and libraries and public transportation.
I think for the most part it's pretty reasonable. My issue, though, I guess my big issue is around alcohol consumption. And I think we really need to apply a lot of these issues around that we apply to drugs and why people can't have drugs for about why people shouldn't be able to have weapons. It isn't for the this law, for the concealed carry, it's for the really responsible person. The problem is guns are a huge social problem in our society, and it's about their kids getting in them. Just the amount of accidental shootings and child deaths throughout the country is a really huge issue that never really gets brought up in this conversation.
And I think you've hit on something there. The problem with guns is really not the law-abiding citizen who goes to your academy and gets training and gets a permit. It's the crime. And we heard in the opening report that Chicago police last year took about 7,000 guns off the street. And we want to pull up a little illustration here of New York versus Chicago and Los Angeles. And we can see here that Chicago police take enormous numbers of guns off the street compared to New York and Los Angeles. And Chief, why do you think that is? Why is Chicago just flooded with these illegal weapons?
Well, I would suspect that people are acquiring weapons from states that really don't have a strong background investigation for people who actually purchase weapons, and those weapons then are brought into our city, or the city of Chicago. But that's probably why they're collecting this. The officers will go out and do effective traffic enforcement while they're involved in that type of enforcement activity. That's when they'll find other evidence of crime and pull out those weapons.
Why so many more here than other big cities?
Well, I think part of it is that Chicago is the most segregated city. It also has just incredible economic disparities. And so I'm sure a lot of those weapons are taking off people that have them just for protection. So we have, issues. You can talk about the closing of 50 schools. It's just being the latest attack on some of these communities where we've just abandoned the communities. There's no economic development going on. We've closed all their schools now. So it's not surprising when you just totally ignore these communities for decades, and now we're just heightening that now that you're going to have a lot of guns.
Well, let's take a look at where they come from. And we have a chart here, and most of them come from Illinois, but outside of Illinois, the number one and number two states are Indiana and Mississippi. And these are states that don't require background checks and have relatively lax gun laws. Joseph, do you think that's why these states are supplying so many weapons that end up in crimes in Chicago?
Yeah, but you also have to put in the mix there our history here in Chicago, especially in regards to organized gangs. And they are organized. Okay, basically, a lot of them flow from Mississippi and Indiana. Of course, Indiana because of the close proximity. So you have a lot of the guns that are on our streets basically coming from those states because of organized gangs.
And Chief, I assume there's a pretty healthy black market. From what I understand, that guns on the street are worth about double what they are in these other states.
And that's true. I think one of the greatest challenges law enforcement has, especially as it relates to concealed carry, is the trafficking of weapons. We all are trying to work together. I think one of the things that we probably can do better as law enforcement agencies is to talk with one another more and communicate about tracing those weapons, where they're coming from, and maybe more of a nationalized database.
Does it make it more difficult that these other states have lax, for example, in Indiana, one can buy as many guns as one wants from someone who calls himself a collector?
Oh, no, absolutely. And Superintendent McCarthy keeps talking about the laws in New York. They're different than Chicago. They're tougher. But the reality is it's the nearby states don't have these lax gun laws. So you have to travel a great distance to go get a weapon that you can buy from a gun dealer or a gun show when you're living in New York City compared to Chicago. I mean, Indiana, Mississippi, they know what they're doing.
And the city council here, Joseph, wants to put tougher restrictions on gun shops, such as videotaping purchases. They want to basically make it very difficult for a gun shop to operate in the city limits. Is that gonna make a difference here with all these guns?
Well, it will prevent it from happening here in the city of Chicago. Will it make a difference? Hard to say. We're still in close proximity to some other gun shops that aren't in our boundaries.
So the city council can make it as difficult as it wants, right? And
Right.
people are still going to go to wherever to get
Exactly.
their
Yeah, this is kind of political coverage. This is them wanting to be able to tell their constituents they've done everything they can, when in reality they know if they make it even just slightly harder than in Indiana or Mississippi, they're going to just continue to get the guns from there.
And you mentioned Superintendent McCarthy. He has been very adamant that this state and this country need tougher gun laws, especially tougher penalties on those who use guns in crimes. Let's hear what he has to say.
Even with the best policing in the world, without laws that help keep illegal guns off of our streets and out of the hands of criminals, we will continue to face an uphill battle. And that's part of the reason that we've seen a slight uptick in shootings so far this year.
Chief Superintendent McCarthy often talks about how New York City has lowered its homicide rate because they have tougher penalties now, 3.5-year minimums for those who are caught with illegal guns. Do you think that's what we need in Illinois?
I would move in a direction like that. I think that people need to see that there are consequences for the types of decisions that they make. So if they do something illegal, then they will have to suffer a greater penalty. I think before we do something like that, I think that we need to kind of refocus on the laws, because I don't think a lot of people understand the total picture of what the law asks. For example, if you are going in a, let's say, an affair, like the Taste of Chicago, if you're walking along the street and you have all the proper documentation of concealed carry, you can carry that weapon. But if you decide to go inside of that area to buy a hot dog, you can't. And then it's unlawful use of weapon. You can be arrested. And I wouldn't want to see someone who's trying to comply with a law get arrested and charged and then suffer a consequence, a severe penalty, because they were just unaware or uninformed. Mr. Snead might teach his students very well, but somebody else might rush somebody out of their schools.
But the penalties do seem to be pretty.
We have to get a little bit away from Superintendent McCarthy's, what is pure propaganda. The mayor's office in New York did a study, they just released it maybe last year, a year and a half ago, where they studied the first 5 years of that mandatory minimum law. Less than half the people that are arrested with it ever get it. It is pure propaganda. New York's crime rate has been going down since the early 90s, has continued.
So you don't think it has anything to do with tougher penalties?
And the mayor's office in New York has the data that proves it doesn't do anything. So it's kind of fiction and it's propaganda. This is political coverage for him. He wants to say this is the reason. As much as, I really respect everything the police do, but these are communities that have social inequalities that are on an unbelievable scale. McCarthy can't solve it, the police department can't solve it, but we keep turning to them to be the saviors in these communities, and they're not going to do it no matter what laws we create.
Well, McCarthy seems to want some help, and here in Illinois, the Chicago Sun-Times did an analysis and found that for people who are convicted of gun law violations, the average term in jail is about a year. And the state's attorney here, Alvarez, thinks that we ought to have much tougher sentences, both on felons and non-felons, and she would like to see people serve 85% of their sentences.
Yes, but what you're doing is you're taking away discretion from the judges, and you're putting it in the state's attorney's office. 95% of cases that are tried in this country that get filed in court end up in plea bargains. So that plea bargain happens in a small office in a state's attorney's office that no one has access to. So what you're going to get is when someone gets busted with a gun and they're facing the mandatory minimum for 3 years, they're going to quickly plead out to some smaller crime. It's not really going to change things. It's just going to make people think we're safer when in reality little has changed.
One of the political mechanisms that's being attempted now is sort of a trade-off where Alvarez is saying, look, why don't you lower the penalties on drug violations and increase them on weapons violations?
Yeah, I would want to see it tied to gun. I think you don't want to mix apples and oranges. If we're dealing with gun issues, what we want to do is, and I'm a proponent of it, educate the public. It's a choice, a personal choice. If someone doesn't like to carry a firearm, they don't have to. But if somebody wants to carry a firearm, make sure that they're trained and educated so that they can educate their children. And that way we don't have crimes occurring inside the home, from possible domestic violent acts, and we don't have criminals out there with access to weapons, because you have somebody who'll know how to break down a weapon, will know how to secure it properly, and limit the number of weapons that get on our streets.
Do you agree with Tracy that this idea of tougher penalties is largely a matter of political smoke and mirrors?
Being a police officer, I know the realities that exist out there. I'd have to support what the superintendent suggests. There is a tie. I don't know what that tie is because I haven't read that study, but I think that when you do enforce laws, and I would be a proponent for increased time served, for violation of the laws, that will lower the cost, because reasonable people will say, I don't want to serve that much time.
Tracy, we have a new governor taking office very soon here in Illinois. How does that change the political dynamic in regards to possible tougher gun legislation?
Well, Governor-elect Rauner's a very good friend of Mayor Emanuel, so my assumption is that that we're probably going to see this pass. It all really depends on Mike Madigan.
When you see this pass, you mean tougher?
Yeah, I think we're
penalties.
probably going to get mandatory minimums for gun crimes in Illinois, despite the fact that 39 years of social science says they don't work. But I have a feeling, considering the mayor and governor-elect are such good friends, that it'll probably pass.
If that particular kind of law doesn't work, in your opinion, what law would?
Basically none.
None.
I know no. I think the police have done all they can. And we've got, as a society, make a decision to stop heaping all of our problems on the police department and start looking, instead of giving $300 million to DePaul to build a stadium that they don't want in an area they don't want it in, and start looking at economic development in these communities. You can ride around Inglewood and see what we haven't done.
So let me put the same question to you, Chief. I mean, if there's one thing that you think could be done to curb gun violence in this area, that one thing would be what?
Enforce stronger background investigations on people that apply for guns and go through concealed carry training.
Chief, you believe in stronger background checks. Tracy, is that going to help?
It probably would help a little bit from straw purchasers if there was somehow to also track how many guns an individual's buying, if that's allowed, and then try to track it for irregularities. Yeah, it could help.
Joe?
No, I actually disagree because background checks are not going to reveal what a person is essentially going to do in regards to selling a gun to their friend illegally.
But if they are criminals, the research has shown that criminals are far more likely to get involved in gun crimes than non-criminals.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But with the background check, I mean, for instance, in regards to an incident that just happened, a young lady, basically her background was clean. She simply sold or
You're talking
gave
about
her
the Nordstrom incident.
The Nordstrom incident. She simply gave her gun to her boyfriend, who could not actually obtain one because of a mental illness he had in the past. That's not going to be revealed in a background check.
Well, yes, it would if we changed the law. See, where the law is flawed is that private individuals can sell weapons, and all they have to do is keep the records for 10 years. But if they're required, just like dealers are required and everybody else, to do that background, that's where that national database comes in, and they just have to submit a name, make the person wait the 72 hours that everybody has to wait to get a gun, and then the national database can do cross-referencing, do the background checks, and then we can capture some of these people that in a 3-year period of time have been into mental facilities or been involved in some type of, gang.
Would that require, though, a change in the federal law? Because after the Connecticut shootings, that was debated, background checks for even private collectors, and Congress overwhelmingly shot that down.
Yeah, it would probably take a change in federal law. It's one that's probably needed, but getting through the lobby is going to be pretty hard.
Joseph, last word.
Last word. I agree with the chief over here. However, how does that basically address if you're reporting a gun stolen, which is in a lot of cases is happening? You report it stolen and then you're giving it to someone.
Yeah, a
Still
lot
not
of
gonna
those
get caught.
can't be stolen
Right.
guns. On that note, thank you very much. I want to thank our guests, Chief Veldemir Talley, Joseph Sneed, Tracy Siska. We appreciate your time today.